This is Near-DeathTV. I'm your host, LURA KETCHLEDGE. I'm also an author. In 1979, I became a near-death experiencer. I chose to explain the truth I learned about the afterlife, reincarnation, and near-death experience through my fictional book series, The Near-Death Saga. While dead, I was shown all human beings are shrouded in ignorance by design, in order to learn valuable lessons in each incarnation. When you die, the artificial facade falls away, and we awaken from the dream into reality. For more information, you can find us at neardeathtv.com. Please join us as we explore the after effects of near-death experience. Welcome to a new episode of Near-Death TV. I'm your host, LURA KETCHLEDGE. I'm also an author, filmmaker, and near-death experiencer. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Eben Alexander. He is a neurosurgeon associated with Harvard School of Medicine, and he is an author and near-death experiencer. Hello, Dr. Alexander. How are you today?
Well, I'm fine, Laura. Thank you very much for having me here. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Let's take our listeners let's take you back, let me say, to November 2008. What dramatic, game-changing experience happened in November 2008?
Well, I think it's important to point out to people I'd spent the first 54 years of my life as kind of a card-toting, reductive, materialist scientist, a neurosurgeon teaching at Harvard Medical School, thought I understood brain, mind, and consciousness. And then in November 2008, as you're alluding to, my world changed dramatically, and it all had to do with a coma that came on very quickly due to a severe gram-negative bacterial meningitis. In fact, it was a meningoencephalitis. My entire brain was inflamed from this thing. Oh. And it drove me into coma within about 3 hours. And my doctors will attest, when I was taken the emergency room seizing and in coma, I had about a 10% chance of survival. 7 days later, I had not really responded to 3 powerful intravenous antibiotics, and yet I was still alive. They had basically estimated I was down to 2% chance of survival at the end of that week and no chance of recovery. And, of course, the story that I told in Proof of Heaven was this extraordinary spiritual journey that I had when, in fact, all the medical details of my case would say that that brain could not have created any kind of hallucination or dream or confabulation or anything. I mean, my neocortex was so heavily involved with this, modern neuroscience would say I could have no consciousness beyond the most minimal kind of hint of kind of deep conscious awareness, and yet I had the most extraordinary, ultra-real, memorable, vivid and alive experience I've ever had in my life. And that's the extraordinary journey, this beautiful, reassuring world showing us that when we leave the physical world, in fact, our mind expands tremendously, more towards what I'd call our higher soul. And that's the beauty of this is that the scientific revolution that's built out of my experience and many similar experiences, and especially over the last 10 years of research, is one that is leading rapidly towards, proof, scientific proof and endorsement of the reality not only of the afterlife, but of reincarnation, that we've been here before. There are extraordinary gifts that come out of the science of consciousness. And this is where the beautiful series of NDE stories out there in the world is the tip of the spear that is allowing this tremendous shift in the scientific understanding of the nature of consciousness and of human understanding of reality.
Oh my goodness. So it's 2008 and you're just seized with this terrible infection, and you're going into a coma. You must have been terrified. Your family was beside themselves. So as you're sliding into the coma, what was your second memory? You're going into the coma, then what happened?
Well, it's very important to point out one of the most unusual features of my near-death experience is the fact that I was amnesic for my entire life up to that point. That's quite strange for an NDE, and yet there's so many other elements of my NDE that line up perfectly with a classical NDE kind of lesson that was there for me. But it had to do with this amnesia was crucial, because when I was first aware deep in my coma, no words or language, no knowledge of Eben Alexander's life, none of my religious beliefs, none of my knowledge of Earth or ever having been a human, none of that remained. I was working with a completely empty slate, and it only became obvious to me in months after my coma why that would be. But what I experienced began in what I call the earthworm's eye view. A very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm. It was like being in dirty jello. And I had a strong memory of kind of a feeling, a tactile sensation of roots or blood vessels around me. It seemed to go forever, because I'm sure with the damage I had in my brain, any kind of memory of time from moment to moment was lost. So for me, it was an eternity. And although it sounds kind of frightening and foreboding, the reality is, given my amnesia, I was perfectly kind of comfortable with it. You know, it sounds horrible when I tell that story in retrospect. People often ask, well, is that earthworm eye view a hell or purgatory or what have you? But the good news is it was just the beginning of my journey, because then came this slowly spinning white light that came packaged with a perfect musical melody. And that white light turned into a portal that ushered me up into this rich, ultra-real place that I called the Gateway Valley. And that valley had many Earth-like features. There were sparkling waterfalls into crystal blue pools and incredibly lush plant life and blossoms and buds and flowers all blooming and blossoming in this rich, dynamic show of pure life. There was no sign of any death or decay anywhere. There were thousands of beings dancing below, and my awareness was actually a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. I had no body awareness during the entire journey.
So you were like consciousness.
Yeah, just a pure piece of conscious awareness of existence. But it was in a world that was in many ways much more real than this one. That's the thing that's so shocking. You know, people often can hear an NDE and they say, oh, yes, well, it's very dreamy and murky. Well, no, this is the dreamy, murky realm. You know, this material world we live in, that world is sharp, crisp, clear, ultra alive, vivid, just soaking in meaning, just an incredibly rich environment. It's kind of like Plato's world of ideals, but for the individual soul on its journey. And so those Earth-like features included thousands of beings that I saw in this meadow down below who were all dancing. There was tremendous joy and merriment. I had strong visions of children playing and dogs jumping, and all of that festivity was being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs that were emanating chants and anthems and hymns that were just thundering through my awareness. And then, in fact, the beautiful witnessing of that, I was not doing it alone. There was this beautiful young woman on the butterfly wing beside me, and of course, I had never really read the near-death experience literature before, and I did read it beginning months after my own journey and realized that that kind of guardian angel is always someone who's very important to you in your life. Now, if I had scripted all this, it would have been my father, the neurosurgeon whose pathway I followed, who had passed over 4 years before my coma. But in fact, he was nowhere to be found in this entire journey, which was a deep mystery to me. But that beautiful woman on the butterfly wing, as those who have read Proof of Heaven will realize, of course, she was a crucial element of all this. Now, this was not the end point of my journey, though, because in fact, that beautiful Gateway Valley where that guardian angel gave me what I believe is the central message I was to bring back to this world. And that message was, you are deeply loved and cherished. You have nothing to fear. You will be taken care of. It was very reassuring. And it did not come in words, but in pure conceptual flow. And in fact, that beautiful Gateway Valley was just kind of a stepping stone to the next layers, because I saw those angelic choirs above. They all coalesced into this beautiful portal of light, just like the light that had led me up from the earthworm eye view into this Gateway Valley. And now there was another portal, once again musically based, And of course, you need to realize in those realms, music is not limited to the kind of music we understand here that is filtered through our ears and then through mechanisms in the brain. In that realm, music can be its full-blown, spectacular majesty that could never occur in this four-dimensional space-time due to the limitations of our physics. But it's important to remember that we can still bring those memories back here as memories of music and vibration and frequency. And in this case, that next portal up through the angelic choirs led me into what I call the core, which was an infinite inky blackness, but filled to overflowing with the infinitely healing love of that divine God force. And this was in a space where all of the higher dimensional universe, beginning with my witnessing of the collapse of four-dimensional space-time, but also the collapse of those spiritual realms that I'd witnessed in the Gateway Valley, that has its own kind of ordering of causality that I call deep time, that is much more kind of primarily ordering than time as we view it here on Earth. And the concept of deep time explains a whole lot about kind of evolution of soul and soul groups and the evolution of all of consciousness. And in that core realm, that is absolutely cannot be reduced to any kind of linguistic description at all. I mean, the words fall so far away from what was actually going on. And in that core realm, I was told, you're not here to stay. We'll teach you many things. You'll be going back. And I remember this brilliant orb of light that was there as kind of a translator or interpreter. But in fact, the entire higher dimensional multiverse throughout all of eternity had been shrunken down to this complex oversphere that was there as part of the lessons to be imparted. I mean, there's no way to describe the core in any kind of words that do it justice. And the interesting thing is I would tumble out of that core kind of spontaneously back down into that lowly level of the earthworm eye view. But what I learned was by recalling the musical notes of the melody that had originally come with that portal that ushered me up into the Gateway Valley, by recalling those musical notes, I could conjure up that light again. So the important lesson is that our souls can use music and vibration and frequency to traverse those many realms. And there finally came a time when, just as I'd been told, you're not here to stay in this core realm, and I tried to conjure up that portal out of the earthworm's eye view after another tumble down and realized it didn't work. But it didn't matter, because I then witnessed thousands of beings around me going off into the distance with their heads bowed and their arms in front of their chests, and there's murmuring energy from them, which I later called in my writings there the kind of the power of prayer, was getting through to me. And I was feeling that even though I was back in this kind of murky earthworm eye view environment, the love and the comfort that came from those murmurings really took me right back to the same love and comfort I had found in the beautiful ultra real Gateway Valley and in the core realm. And yet here I was back in that murky realm. And then I witnessed the 6 faces that appeared that were very important in timing of the journey. 5 of them were faces of people physically present in the ICU room my last 24 hours of coma. And of note, there were many family and friends who had been there earlier in the week who I had no memory of whatsoever. So in fact, those faces helped to time the vast majority of the coma experience to have happened between days 1 and 5 of coma. There's a recent medical report in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases on my medical records that came out in September 2018. And that case report is by 3 doctors who were not involved in my care, but were fascinated by my complete recovery over 2 months from a disease that should have killed me or at least left me completely maimed, and yet it did not. And that's why they wrote it up. But in that case report, they actually go so far as to say that the medical explanation for my recovery is the fact that I had a profoundly spiritual near-death experience, and that contributed greatly to my recovery, which is a very important statement to be made in the peer-reviewed medical literature.
Yeah, that's pretty brave, because I'm sure that they had some big questions from your colleagues. Dr. Alexander, you found yourself in this more dense reality, non-physical reality, and then you ascended into this gateway. Was this a consensus reality? Was it, did you see any blackness around and then see areas of portals of light? Could you describe it a little bit?
Yeah, so I would say the initial experience, that gateway, the earthworm eye view, was a very kind of primitive, coarse, dark, and murky environment. The strangest thing about it was so completely unresponsive. People have often asked me, do you think that was hell or purgatory? And I would think, hell would be at least a little bit interactive. And it was none of that. I had curiosity in my mind, even though I had no words or language. I could wonder, who, what, where, how, and never was there a flicker of response to that kind of questioning on my behalf. But then once I got into the Gateway Valley, that ultra real realm with all those souls dancing below and all these millions of butterflies and these vast spiraling formations and this incredibly rich plant growth and all of that, that was a completely different world. And much more kind of memorable, more meaningful. Everything about it kind of hitched together, and even just the slightest question coming up in your mind was met with this ocean of kind of solid truth answer. It was just a stunning environment of kind of the world of ideals and a place to kind of learn and teach. And what I would say is that's where all of us go, is that kind of a realm. Now, the details of how you report it are going to be different depending on your soul journey, and certainly someone's prior religious beliefs might flavor the language they use to describe it. But the interesting thing is when you study hundreds and thousands of these NDEs, is you realize that the content is very similar in terms of kind of the lessons of love and of the power of mind and of our soul journey. These things are very kind of consistent across many of these stories. And in fact, the differences are far less than the similarities when you read these with a very open mind and realize that they are always tailored to the individual soul. So, for example, mine, as a neurosurgeon, a neuroscientist fascinated with consciousness and physics, it would involve certain lessons that would help me to progress in my understanding about all that. And that's why I think so much of the content was there. But the interesting thing is, for example, my journey showed me very clearly the reality of things like an identity with God. That is, that our in those deepest realms, in the core realm, we become one with that infinitely healing, loving force of that God force. Of course, our ego and our little petty human thoughts are not in the same kind of ballpark as that, but you can bet that the origin of our awareness and our higher soul and what we experience when we are no longer shackled by the confines of the physical body and brain is something that allows us to become much more unified with that infinitely loving force. So oneness with God is not a concept that was taught to me in my Methodist church growing up in North Carolina. Likewise, reincarnation. My journey showed me very clearly there was no way to make sense of the infinitely loving and knowing God force that I witness in the core without understanding that reincarnation must be part of the package. There's no way to explain, especially the suffering of innocence, like children who die too young and animals, all that kind of thing, if we weren't coming back again and again. But the important thing to remember is homicide and suicide are violations of some of the most fundamental tenets of this life force at the origin of all that is. And so those are, in general, I would say, homicide and suicide are not correct responses at all. And our lives have much more purpose when we start to realize we've been here before, and that, in fact, this process of evolving consciousness and growing towards oneness with the divine is something that can only occur over multiple lifetimes. You can't make all that progress in one lifetime. And the scientific evidence for reincarnation is very strong. Just go to University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies scientific website, that's uvadops.org, and look at the tremendous information there, including support for more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children studied scientifically over the last 6 decades that strongly support the reality of reincarnation. Once you start getting all of this and figuring out that it's all real, then you realize that our scientific models of consciousness just need to be much, much bigger. You know, to continue, as I did before my coma, to stand in the way of scientific progress by saying, but wait a minute, our physicalist or materialist models of brain-create consciousness do not allow for all these things to happen. Well, that's a theoretical model that just happens to be false. And the models that, for example, we describe in our newest book, Living in a Mindful Universe, that support the reality of objective idealism as the guiding principle of the universe, are much more robust, where you look at consciousness as a primordial constituent of the universe that then is responsible for generating all the emerging physical reality. And this mental layer of the universe is one that humans, of course, because of our brain, we have access to that mental layer. And it's a top-down causal force in the universe. And you can look at the brain then as a filter that allows in this primordial consciousness. And with these kind of models, and again, they're fully covered in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, and people can learn more at my website, ebenalexander.com. But this is where the scientific community is waking up tremendously to the reality, not only of the afterlife, but of reincarnation, and coming up with far more robust models of relationship of brain and mind to explain our experience that fit empirical data and have rational argument to support them. Whereas the tenets of science that support purely materialism or physicalism, that is, that only the physical world exists, have basically been ruled out. And the last 80 years, with the advent of quantum physics, has been the grounds on which our scientific materialism and the notion that materialist science puts out there that we don't have free will, given that it's all chemical reactions and electron fluxes in the brain, giving an illusion of consciousness. Luckily, that is not true. We do have free will, and we are responsible for our choices. And that is, I think, what is the most important revelation, excuse me, in addition to the fact that the scientific study of consciousness actually reveals that we're all really sharing one mind, and that this consciousness is unified, even though it seems to us to be compartmentalized into our separate kind of versions of self. But in fact, there's plenty of evidence about the reality of telepathy, precognition, remote viewing, psychokinesis, many other kind of examples of non-local consciousness to show that our scientific models need to be greatly expanded.
Well, let me tell you, that is a absolute game changer in your conception of life. But in non-physical reality, the beauty, the music, the experience, it must have been the most joyful form of acceptance when you entered that gateway valley. Were you able to, because the non-physical reality is more thought responsive, were you able to, when you thought of things, go to a place, like if you thought of the ocean, you would actually be there? Were you able to travel around that gateway consensus reality?
Well, you know, the interesting thing is I really felt like I was kind of shown around. In other words, I did not feel, even though I could have some questions about things and then have these incredibly robust answers that were absolutely complete. So in that sense, yes, there was a tremendous interaction. But on the other hand, I felt very strongly like it was my higher soul or something that was far beyond, you know, just my little ego, but it was definitely part of me. Mm-hmm. that was guiding the tour, guiding the journey. It was a fascinating thing. For me, what it left me with was a tremendous sense of trust in the universe, trust in a higher soul, trust in this kind of primordial mind to lead us and show us to what we need to know. And that's why I think near-death experiences can be so powerful and so life-affirming and life-changing. They're kind of a mid-course correction to help us get back on a much more solid path. And I would say, in general, for our society at large, the whole world of NDEs, and I think Ken Ring has written about this extensively, how just introducing the world to the concept of NDEs isn't enough to actually cause tremendous beneficial change in the world. So in other words, not every soul has to have an NDE to change this whole world tremendously. We just have to talk about them, get this out there enough. And from my point of view, I've come to realize over the last 10 years, I meditate an hour or two a day. I use sacred acoustics, and people who want to learn about that very powerful sound tool, you know, using differential frequency sounds to get into profound transcendental states of conscious awareness, just go to sacredacoustics.com. And another way people can get involved in all that is if you go to unitedinhopeandhealing.com. That's a series of webinars that my partner and co-author of the book Living in a Mindful Universe, Karen Newell, who is also the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics, but that unitedinhopeandhealing.com is a site we've generated to help people, especially in this time of the pandemic, especially with all of the challenges and kind of causes of anxiety out in this world. We're trying to point out to people that there are very powerful tools that we can use by going within through meditation to greatly strengthen our kind of emotional and spiritual resolve and our ability to handle these kind of challenges. And that is something people can really get on board with at unitedinhopeandhealing.com. And another kind of parallel pathway for that same body of work is innersanctumcenter.com. But these are all our efforts to kind of get this knowledge and this understanding out to the world at large.
Excellent. Now, let me just take you back. You know, you've had the near-death experience. You have gone to source. You have gotten some healing and returned. What were your after effects? And I'm not talking about the profound change of understanding and your expanded awareness. Did you return, Dr. Alexander, with some special insights, new abilities, new connections, quote unquote, psychic abilities of any?
Well, I would say I did, but I need to start by saying that when I first came back to this world, which was day 7 of coma, my doctors had predicted I was, you know, never going to wake up. And so when I was opening my eyes, everybody was kind of shocked. But the reality is, all I knew when I came back to this world was the journey I had just been on. In fact, I did not even recognize loved ones at the bedside, like my mother, my sisters, my sons.
Oh, my.
I had no idea who these beings were. My brain was trashed by this experience, very damaged. The good news is my words and language started coming back literally within the first few hours. And within a day or two, most of that was back. Over the next week or two, a lot of my childhood memories returned. By basically 2 months out, everything had returned. And in fact, shocking to me is I came to realize, especially based on conversations with close family and friends about very distant past memories, I came to realize that after that 2 month time point, my memories were more complete than they had been before my coma.
Oh,
and
wow.
we go into a lot of that in the book Living in a Mindful Universe about all the scientific evidence that memories are not even stored in the physical brain. This is a crucial nail in the coffin of materialist neuroscience. But of course, once you admit the reality of reincarnation, you've got to realize that a certain aspect of memory does not depend on brains for its storage, because between lives, you don't have a brain to store it in. But getting back to your question, so it took me 2 months to recover, and that was a very complete recovery that was shocking to all involved. In fact, that's why the peer reviewers of that case report on my medical records wanted to know, how do you all explain this? The same thing that haunted me when I reviewed my own medical records, because I was thinking, this is not somebody who recovers. These are the medical records of someone who goes on to die from this horrific illness. How could anybody in this shape ever have a complete recovery? And the explanation from the authors of that medical study, and this explanation was clearly valuable to the peer reviewers, was that the spiritual content of my NDE had led to that extraordinary recovery. Now, you mentioned a question about kind of the other after effects, like microelectronics are frequently an area where people have strong after effects because of the quantum nature of microelectronics. And yes, I would walk down the street and street lights would go out when I passed underneath them, but I just attributed it to, infrastructure failure, or my computer crashed a lot more than it had before, and I simply attributed that to outsourcing, app by Apple to China or something. I always just dismissed it. I didn't realize until I read a lot more of the NDE literature that these kind of things are very common. In fact, I had to go through 3 wristwatches, before I finally found one that worked. And the interesting thing about that watch is even though it appeared mechanically broken because of the stem and other things, it actually kept perfect time. Month to month, it didn't lose or gain a second. But it took me a while to get to that watch because an after effect of the NDEs that you have so much of this kind of psychic quantum energy kind of flying around that it disrupts local microelectronics. And then as to intuition and kind of grokking and my powers of empathy and understanding of others, I would say were greatly enhanced through this. Although I would not claim to have any strong telepathic connection with others other than people that I'm very close to. But otherwise, just an incredible sense of intuition that dwarfs what I seem to have had before. So I'm very grateful for all that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I will also, it's completely shifted my worldview to where I now realize we're all really sharing one mind. We're all really one giant soul, and it's not just humans. We're involved with all forms of life and with sentience throughout the universe, and we are part of all that through our very consciousness. But don't be fooled into thinking consciousness was something that evolved with Homo sapiens. Consciousness is something that all living beings have kind of they borrow it from the universe. I would simply say it's a layer of causality that pre-existed the Big Bang. It's really about how consciousness creates the unfolding universe, and each and every one of us has, the power to interact with that consciousness and that mental layer of consolidation, and that's why things like placebo effect are so powerful. Placebo effect, which is widely acknowledged by doctors and has been for more than 6 decades now, is simply an admission that somebody's beliefs can have tremendous mind over matter power in determining their health. And medical science has acknowledged the reality of placebo and mind over matter for decades. And yet we still kind of insist publicly that we believe in materialist science and all the material causes, and yet everybody uses as the gold standard, placebo effect. You've got to take any new treatment that you're proposing and compare it to the power of belief. And in fact, I would say that near-death experiences in many ways show the power of this belief because of the spiritual content of the journey is often sufficient to lead to miraculous healing. That's what the doctors who did my case report concluded, and likewise, others who look at, for example, Anita Morjani's story, dying to be me, and her stage 4 advanced lymphoma that just absolutely disappeared after her near-death experience, and something that is inexplicable from the standpoint of Western medicine. Or look at Mary C. Neal, the orthopedic surgeon who had a kayaking accident in Chile, was underwater for more than 30 minutes. In a warm water drowning. That doesn't happen. You don't come back from that, yet she made a full recovery. And so there's something powerful about these kind of spiritual journeys and spiritual awareness where we can really heal ourselves to a much higher level of satisfaction, I believe, when we start to pay attention to these cases.
What were your 3 main points, when you were writing Proof of Heaven? What were your 3 main objectives to get across to the reader?
Well, I'm not sure if I just had 3. I think it was mainly to put out there that these experiences are very real. Don't be fooled into believing that it's all just some hallucination. And of course, the medical data was there in my case, with all the evidence for the damage to my neocortex, basically having a Glasgow coma scale, which in you or me right now would be 15. In a corpse, it would be 3. Anything below 9 is deep coma. And the doctors who wrote the case report said for the vast majority of that week I was in coma, my Glasgow coma score was between 6 and 7. In fact, there's a lot of evidence it went as low as 5. but it never went high enough to be considered, above coma level. And given the MRI and CT scans, it showed that all 8 lobes of my brain were affected. There's a profound amount of scientific information there. That's why I think the scientific community takes my case so seriously. But the main reasons I put it out there is I came to realize that our modern kind of materialist science view of brain creating consciousness is wrong. And there's plenty of evidence to support much more robust models that fully allow for the reality of NDEs and the afterlife and reincarnation and psychokinesis, telepathy, precognition, remote viewing. These are all things that have been scientifically studied and found to be real. We just need better explanations, and that's what I was trying to do. Proof of heaven was an initial effort to do that, but when I look back on it, I would say proof of heaven was more of a question mark, saying these things happen, but how are we to explain them? And then the other books, The Map of Heaven was my second book, and that one goes a long way towards just saying these things happen to many, many people, not just to the occasional guy who writes a book. But, it happens to millions of people out there. You can find tens of thousands of reports on the internet. So this is part of human experience. We need a much better explanation than just pretending, it can't happen because it doesn't fit the theoretical models of physicalism. And so really the whole thing, in Living in a Mindful Universe, that third book, really starts getting at big answers about it. And that book has been fully supported by a number of some of the most renowned and respected scientific investigators of consciousness in the modern era. You just can go to EbenAlexander.com and look at the page on Living in a Mindful Universe. You'll find endorsements there from Ed Kelly and Dean Radin and Bruce Grace and Jim Tucker, Bernardo Kastrup. I mean, the list goes on and on. Larry Dossey. I mean, all these brilliant minds who have been working on these issues for years and realize the primacy of consciousness, and they're supporting our work.
Well, today with the internet and communication like we've never had before, and the fact that, modern science can bring back people today, with CPR, adrenaline to the heart, modern medicine is resuscitating people that never would have survived, let's say, 60 years ago. So this massive kind of awakening and interaction with and exchange of information has been a profound shift, I think, in people's concepts, which is fantastic. And I'm so glad someone as esteemed as yourself would have the courage to write Proof of Heaven. Now, where can people buy Proof of Heaven?
Well, I mean, you should be able to buy it most places you buy books. That's
Amazon?
But if Amazon, yes, totally. And of course, you can also, if you go to EbenAlexander.com, we have listed all the main book purveyors there, indie books and what have you. So you can click on any source that you prefer and go get it. It's also out there as an audiobook. And a lot of people who have both listened to the audiobook and read the written book, a couple ways saying they got more out of the audiobook, even though the audiobook is the very same words without exception, but hearing it in my voice coming from the heart, for a lot of people is an even more powerful way to listen to this story. My emotions really come through when I read Proof of Heaven. And in fact, I've read all 3 of my books. The third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, Karen Newell, my co-author, also reads certain of the parts in the audiobook. But the audiobooks are a beautiful way to really get the heart and soul of the message beyond just the written word.
I have a question that I think everybody would like to know. While you were out of body and having your near-death experience, you went to the source. Am I correct? The collection of, or called the I there, how would you describe it? And did you meet the different personalities of your past lives?
Well, what I ran into, what I call that God force, and it was first apparent to me in my journey, the source that you're referring to. Remember now that when I first started that earthworm eye view and then came up into that brilliant ultra-real Gateway Valley, that, remember that I had no kind of memory of anything before.
Of course.
And so I was going from complete amnesia. I was building up from this empty slate to kind of reconstruct my vision of reality. And as I was on that beautiful butterfly wing with that lovely young guardian angel and all this beautiful joy and merriment going on below us in the valley, there was a soft summer breeze that blew through. And in fact, in looking back on it, that was my first awareness of the power of that divine, that infinitely loving God force, and that soft summer breeze. In my early writings, I call that the breath of God, or a divine wind. And it turns out that though, was just the beginning, because soon after I witnessed that soft breeze, the angelic choirs were providing the musical portals to higher and higher levels. And that's when I went through that portal and emerged in that core realm, witnessing all of four-dimensional space-time collapsing down, then all the spiritual realms and deep time collapsing down, all the way out into that kind of magnificent infinite eternity of the core realm. And the thing that was so shocking, I'm sorry, what?
I mean, did you feel like zooming, like you were like a vibration was making you less dense and carrying you inward? Or did you feel a sense of motion as you were going through these layers?
Oh, there was a tremendous sense of motion, but it was much more almost like a resonating at a kind of a higher and higher frequency to get up to those refined levels, all the way out to that core realm. But the interesting thing, as I pointed out earlier, was that identification, that sense of self merging as one with that love force, that incredibly powerful force. I came away as seeing it as the very origin of our conscious awareness. So we're never separate from it at all. That's the kind of strange mystery. Although I also would say that I came to see that the apparent evil and darkness that we sometimes see in this realm and certainly in spiritual journeys,
yes,
in many ways was only the absence of the light and dark. So, I mean, of the light and love. So it's not as if this seemed like some battle between good and evil, where someday maybe the forces of evil would win out, or maybe the forces of good. But in fact, that it was just that apparent darkness and evil was just the absence of it. So by serving as points of light and conduits, we can all, as sentient beings, bring that light and love into this universe and completely dispel those forces of darkness. It's simply by bringing them in, by serving as that conduit that we can serve a tremendous purpose for this universe and help to bring good and love into the world. And I would say near-death experiencers exemplify that beautifully. I would say all of our religious systems have come from, something like a near-death experience, something that showed people that there's more than just this material realm, that there's more to who we are and all of that. And near-death experiences in many ways are kind of the tip of the spear. And as you pointed out earlier, I guess the world got tired of the 5,000-year history of having the occasional prophet or mystic report these journeys and then wondering whether or not people would take up religious orthodoxies and believe them or not. And although there were certainly personal experiences through spontaneous epiphanies and prayer and what have you, the game was really upped in the 1960s when doctors developed techniques to resuscitate cardiac arrest patients, because whereas before just about all such patients died, now tens of millions of souls have been to the other side and then come back here because of these resuscitation techniques. And that is no accident. I think that's one of the reasons why near-death experiences are really kind of taking over the world's psyche in many ways, is because they are echoing and reflecting to us something profound and more extraordinary about our existence than our everyday, waking consensus reality. But the scientists who study the brain-mind connection, even in our normal everyday world, are at a complete loss as to any way to explain how the brain might create consciousness. And the reason is the brain does not create consciousness. It only serves as a filter that allows primordial consciousness in. And this is a scientific model that is really taking over the world. It combines the findings of the neuroscience of consciousness, the philosophy of mind, of quantum physics, and combines all of this to support the reality of the primacy of mind in the universe. And that's where the whole world needs to upshift, because that very concept will bring a tremendous amount of peace and harmony and healing to this world at large, because we'll realize we're truly all in it together. And to hurt another is to hurt oneself. So don't do it.
Exactly, exactly. Dr. Alexander, I mean, I imagine that you take great comfort, because this is no longer a belief that we have, you know, continuation of existence after death. This is a known to you. And that has probably, as myself, a near-death experiencer, given great comfort to myself and others. Have you shared this with friends and family that were ill, or patients that were on their journey towards death? Have you given them some sort of comfort with your explanations?
Yes, tremendously. In fact, I mean, I think one of the greatest benefits I get out of all this is by going public with my story, many people trust me, and they therefore share their stories. I mean, one of the main reasons I wrote Proof of Heaven was to show the scientific validity of these experiences and to invite people to share their own experiences. It's only by, you know, looking at these things en masse and really paying attention to them and looking at the patterns and the, you know, the general rules that we can discern from them that we can really make progress. And so I go around sharing my story. I've given presentations talking to more than 140,000 people in various groups over the last 11 years or so. I think, you know, certainly I get feedback from all those groups of how much they've benefited from my sharing. And in reality, the details of that kind of an interchange are that they often share their own stories with me. And that is a gift that I cannot put a value on, because it is so absolutely essential to my own journey, is these repeated confirmations and affirmations coming from, you know, the general people out in the street, out in ordinary reality, who have had similar experiences, and then share those with me. So it's a huge interchange back and forth, but our entire society is greatly, you know, enhanced and educated by the sharing of these kind of stories and their deeper understanding to be shared with all. I mean, there's no question in my mind that NDEs are the tip of the spear in the science of consciousness studies that will absolutely change this world for the better.
While you were in source, while you were out of your body, and you were in that beautiful divine white light, do you believe that your physical body here in physical reality, that's when the healing started to begin?
I suspect so. I mean, I really, you know, what my doctors were seeing was really somebody who was not doing any healing until my eyes popped open. I mean, you know, on day 7 of coma, because before that, all they'd seen was somebody who was very, very sick, who didn't seem to be responding to 3 very powerful intravenous antibiotics, and who really, you know, on that Sunday morning, when I came out of coma, they'd actually held a family conference recommending it was time to stop the antibiotics, time to just let nature take its course. And the main problem was they saw that I'd been in this coma so long and my brain was so damaged that it really didn't leave any realistic possibility whatsoever for recovery. And that was true based on Western medical precepts. But that's why the case report is so crucial. Is it shows, well, this was not some ordinary case that can be explained by Western medical concepts at all. There was far too much evidence of the damage to my brain and how ill I was. You know, loss of an oculocardiac reflex with a Glasgow Coma scale around 5, 6, or 7 is devastating. Having a CSF glucose level, the sugar level in my spinal fluid, you know, and you or me right now, that would be 80. In somebody with a severe bacterial meningitis, that sugar level might be 20. Well, my sugar level was 1. None of the consultants up and down the eastern seaboard had ever seen a case of meningoencephalitis where the glucose level was down to 1. And I found no cases of, you know, of similar degree of this kind of meningitis with any kind of robust recovery. It just doesn't happen in our regular world. And yet, these kind of things do happen in the setting of a profound near-death experience, and that was the point that the doctors made to satisfy the peer reviewers at the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases in publishing my case report that came out in September 2018. was that the additional ingredient that allowed for this recovery was the spiritual nature of the content of the NDE.
While out of body, Dr. Alexander, were you given the choice to come back or to stay there? Did that happen for you? It happens to quite a few people.
It happens to many, and what I will tell you is, to me, you know, I felt like for the most part I was being driven around, as I told you, that it was not my free will determining how I went on this, although I could change levels, you know, willfully. But at the end of the day, the thing that brought me back was that sixth face that I saw in coma, and it was the face of a 10-year-old boy. Now, of course, I didn't know it at the time, but it was my son Bond, and they had protected him from the worst news of this of my medical case through the week. But that Sunday morning, when they held the family conference, you know, they said it was time to stop the antibiotics and let me go. And Bond was outside the door, overheard that, came running down the hall, whipped open my eyelids, and you know, was pleading with me, "Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay," as if somehow that would make it so. And I didn't recognize him in any way. I didn't hear him with my ears or see him with my eyes, but his pleading got all the way into those deep spiritual levels, and I was aware of it. And although, you know, my amnesia had allowed me to be fearless through this entire journey, I always thought it could continue or cease. It didn't matter. And now all of a sudden it mattered a lot, because I felt this deep connection with his soul, even though I didn't know who he was. And in that moment, I knew I had to be there for him, but I had no understanding of what that meant. And it was really the only moment of sheer kind of terror in the entire journey. You know, because all of a sudden now it all did matter, and I had to do something right, and yet I didn't understand the rules of this world. So, can we take about a 1-minute break here? I've got to do one thing with our dogs.
Yeah, no problem. And we're back. Dr. Alexander, could you share your views on reincarnation? That's question 1. And question 2, have you connected with any of your past life memories?
Okay, very good question. Well, you know, when I came back from my coma journey, as I told you minutes ago, in trying to make sense of it all, the only way to make sense of that infinitely loving, powerful, and knowing God force was to realize that all that suffering of innocence, like children killed in warfare, etc., could not have come from such a God unless reincarnation were part of the package. That is, that their entire soul journey was not that one incarnation, but involved that incarnation and many others. And so, but, you know, I had no idea that there was a huge scientific literature on reincarnation. I'd never studied that. I was not aware of it. Also, it's important to point out that during my coma experience, reincarnation and life reviews were shown to me in very powerful formats. One was kind of a vision where I saw kind of an ender's net of interconnected threads of lifelines of, you know, billions of sentient beings throughout the universe, and all of these threads leading towards a center of light, kind of like Teilhard de Chardin's Omega Point, or Christ consciousness, that he described in his book, The Phenomenon of Man. And that was shown to me very clearly, but essential in that vision were these notions of reincarnations with these alternating threads of lifetimes that all led towards this beautiful goal. And the other way that I saw it in my coma, in terms of reincarnation and life reviews, was as schools of flying fish. And I had this beautiful image that it's such a sweet memory from the whole thing, where these fish are down in the water, swimming in the density of the material realm, temporarily kind of dumbed down to what their higher souls know, and then they pop up out of the water. That would be when we leave the physical body at the time of physical body death, and are enlightened, rejoined with our higher souls, go through life reviews, you know, reconnecting with loved ones, planning the next incarnations, then diving back in, knowing full well that there is programmed forgetting. Just like dreams and sleep are very important, but we don't really know why. If you don't dream or sleep, you know, for a few weeks, you'll be dead. And yet dream and sleep occur in animals going way down the evolutionary chain. We We are pretty sure of all that. And the reality is, and also in past life, but remember that we don't remember our dreams generally. So important content, and yet we know not why. Likewise, between lives, we come back in forgetting. Dr. Jim Tucker, who heads up UVA DOPS now and all their studies of past life memories in children, will tell you that those memories start to fade at age 5 or 6. Why is it that we have this programmed forgetting? I don't know, but it's part of the bigger package. And of course, there's the whole world of transpersonal psychology, thanks to the work of Dr. Stan Grof, Michael Newton, Brian Weiss, and others, where we come to realize that the best way to make sense of psychological issues in this lifetime are to realize that we've faced big issues in past lifetimes, and they're being repackaged as part of our learning and teaching in this lifetime. Transpersonal psychology just admits up front that we're more than just this physical body, and we're more than just this one little lifetime. And then you can make better sense of kind of soul journeys and challenges and hardships. Reincarnation, if people who want to learn more, go to uvadops.org. That website, University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies. You'll find a tremendous number of writings there from Ian Stevenson, Jim Tucker, and many others that go far beyond just the reincarnation literature to all aspects of consciousness. It's a very rich source. And then you were asking about my own past life experiences. I've actually had some past life regressions that were very, very interesting. And I use meditation. I use sacred acoustics, and people who want to learn more about that very powerful technique can go to sacredacoustics.com. But for me, I've used that kind of thing and uncovered some very powerful memories in past lives, some that involved the Western Plains back in the 1800s, but some going back, I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of years to kind of a cave existence. I mean, I've had a tremendous number of those visions. But the problem is, how do you as an individual soul try to corroborate and turn that into objective empirical data? Unless you are a reincarnation of a famous historical being that can be, details can be uncovered through various sources, most of us were just, ordinary people in these past lives. And so uncovering the details of that and trying to make a scientific objective comparison to prove the validity of your perceptions is difficult. Although I can tell you, having been through some of those, I mean, the reality of them is kind of hard to deny. And then you got to wonder, where did it come from? Was it just some chaotic, imaginary memory, drilled up out of nothing? Or was it really part of some existence that part of me has shared in the past? And they certainly seem like that's the case. But, the proving it scientifically is kind of the big challenge.
Oh, yes, of course. Do you feel that most people accept reincarnation more than they used to? It's become more of a general idea?
Oh, yeah, I think a lot more people are. And one specific example is a Scientific American. That's a bastion of materialist scientific thought. And recently, in Scientific American, in their blog online, there have been several interesting papers, and there was one in particular that just came out a few weeks ago that was a reflection on the work of Ian Stevenson, who was the UVA psychiatrist who started the Division of Perceptual Studies and started studying past life memories in children back in the 1960s. And the Scientific American article addresses Ian Stevenson's work very directly. And the title of it, I don't recall exactly, but it was something like, are we all just cynics, or are we being, scientific about Stevenson's work and the evidence for reincarnation? And the hardcore conclusion of that article in Scientific American was that they were mainly being cynical. And that when you actually looked at it as a scientific body of knowledge, and this was my impression when I read a lot of Stevenson's work, is it's undeniable. Reincarnation is a fact. Get used to it. We then just have to figure out how it all works. But I think Stevenson was such a careful scientist and a respected scientist, and now Jim Tucker is carrying on his work beautifully. And I think you'd be a damn fool to read all of that information and then say, well, it's got to be some mass hysteria or, somebody is gaming everybody else and making it up or what have you. There's no way to come away with that kind of a dumbed down conclusion about it when you read all of Stevenson's work. It's just astonishing, and it was very well accomplished in a scientific fashion. And then especially when you combine it with all the transpersonal psychology work, where people are actively using past life memories, hypnotic regression, meditation, etc., ways to get to those memories, and then getting real powerful, profound therapeutic benefit from the details uncovered in those kind of explorations. It's because, yes, we are multi-lifetime beings. Our soul journey is much bigger than you could ever compress into one puny little lifetime. Our knowledge of consciousness and brain and mind is at such a completely primitive level. This really needs to go to the next level, and that's where the science is very impressive, and reincarnation is one of the most crucial pieces, because essentially near-death experiences, as amazing and common as they are, and as overlapping as they are in their qualities and in some of the deep lessons, they will ultimately never provide a proof of the afterlife, because all those people came back to this world. But when you look at consciousness writ large, look at the quantum physics, look at the neuroscience of consciousness, the reality of non-local consciousness, like telepathy, remote viewing, out-of-body experiences, precognition, psychokinesis, all these scientifically validated forms of non-local consciousness, you realize we have a much bigger fish to fry in terms of explaining all this, and it cannot fit within the puny, tidy little materialist assumptions that are just false at their most obvious level. And that's why we need a bigger version of understanding, and that's where the science of consciousness is headed.
Mm-hmm. So before your 2008 illness and near-death experience, you were leading, I imagine, a very charmed life. You're a doctor, a neurosurgeon, you have a beautiful wife, lovely children, a leader in the community. Had you not had that near-death experience and someone else had written a book similar to Proof of Heaven, would you have believed it, or it was because you had the experience, you expanded your awareness, but would you have been able to absorb a book similar to yourself?
Absolutely, and the facts are all through it. And in fact, this is something, especially when you read the other two books, and most especially the third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. I mean, we've moved far beyond just kind of idle conjecture and wondering about these things to actually coming up with a scientific model of reality that accepts them and encourages them and works with them to get to a much deeper set of truths about reality. The evidence is there. In fact, I often publicly state that by the year 2028, no self-respecting, scientifically minded, intellectual, and well-read person on Earth will doubt the reality, not only of the afterlife, but of reincarnation. And it's because the scientific evidence is overwhelming. That is actually the case today, if you take the time to do the homework.
Yes,
and
evidence is stacking up.
It's already true that the evidence is all around us, that consciousness is far more than can be explained by, the brain and body. And the evidence is overwhelming, and yet you find there are still pseudo-skeptics out there. Now, they might call themselves skeptics, but, a true skeptic, I often say, and I've said since the beginning of my journey, that true open-minded skepticism is a real gift in this journey. In fact, I was my own worst skeptic at the beginning. To me, it had to be some vast hallucination because it was way too real to be real. And yet what I came to realize is that there is definitely a scientific, empirically based and a kind of a model of worldview that fits together that can accept every bit of this. And that's why I would say, especially if the me before coma had seen the book Living in a Mindful Universe, I would have come away absolutely knowing the reality of every bit of this and been pursuing deep meditation and exploration of consciousness to try and enhance my skills and further my understanding of all of this. But what it really means is human beings have far greater influence on their emerging reality than I would have thought before my coma. And just like we've known in placebo effect, admitting that for decades as showing the power of belief, mind over matter in the real world, especially as pertains to our healing, this evidence for non-local consciousness and this whole revolution we're talking about in Living in a Mindful Universe is one that will greatly enhance humans' own ability to influence their emerging reality. And it starts with our health, but we can move beyond that and show far greater influence. But the most important lesson is that old teaching of materialist science that we're all separate from each other, and that misinterpretation of Darwinian evolution to pretend that it's just survival of the fittest and it's all about competition. We need to leave those outmoded thoughts behind us. Evolution is far grander than just that little version viewed by Darwin. I look at it more like the evolution pointed out by Teilhard de Chardin. And this is really where our capabilities and our influence on unfolding reality can become much stronger as we study these kinds of influences of mind over matter more fully.
Can you explain how comforting it is to have the firsthand knowledge of physical, that we're more than our physical bodies, that we have a continuation of existence? Can you share words of comfort to someone perhaps that is struggling with their illness, or they're at the time in their life where they may have just lost a loved one?
Well, I think all of this can be very, very comforting there. And I see evidence for that all the time, in all my interactions with people. I mean, just from a personal standpoint, I can tell you, it was about a year ago, April 10th of 2019, that my mother left this physical world. And my own experience with her, being at her bedside, sharing all this with her, especially after all the conversations we had about these things, she was very comfortable. She had no fear whatsoever. She was smiling. She knew where all this was going. And I remember some conversations I had with her in the last week or two that she was alive. She was looking forward to it. She knew she was going to be reunited with my dad. And, for her, it was a very different experience than I would say occurred back with my father, who had passed over 4 years before my coma. Now, I was not there when he passed. He passed suddenly in the middle of the night. But I can tell you our whole family dealt very differently with my mother's passing in 2019 than we had with my father's passing in 2004. And a lot of that kind of benefit and acceptance and, in fact, looking on it as an adventure had to do with much of what I had discovered, not only from my near-death experience in 2008, but in the years, 11 plus years since that coma experience. So much of my growth and understanding leads to a lot more comfort. And there are those pseudo-skeptic scientists who say, well, they just want to believe it because it feels good. Well, isn't it nice that the truth actually is something that gives us a lot of comfort, as opposed to that cold, bleak, paltry fiction of scientific materialism that when you die, your consciousness snuffs away to nothing, and that's the end. As if all that kind of thinking and energy and experience could just be lost from the universe. Well, it's not. It's part of the ongoing record of all of sentience, and that's a very kind of joyful and affirming truth that's important to get out to this world. Many people are grieving, especially in this age of the COVID pandemic, when we have now close to 40,000 deaths in the USA alone from this pandemic. There's a tremendous amount of death and misery going on out in this world, But the important thing is to remember that if we kind of get with our higher souls and see this bigger version of who we are, where we're multi-lifetime beings and that we're progressing towards this oneness with the divine, it's not the kind of reincarnation idea, for example, in some religious systems where it's a mechanistic wheel you're trying to get off of, but in fact one that is directed towards a goal of understanding, of teaching, learning, and knowing, of identification with the universe. That's where this bigger vision of reincarnation and the bigger vision of consciousness and what it involves, and of free will of human spirit, all of that blossoms tremendously under this emerging scientific model of consciousness.
Well, the powerful message that you convey of hope and love and decency and proof of heaven is a must-read book. Please, if you wouldn't mind, we're going to be closing this show. Name your three books and where people can get them, and your website, please.
Okay, well, you can learn a whole lot if you go to Eben, that's EBEN, Alexander.com. All the books are listed there. Proof of Heaven was the first book that, that was an international bestseller. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 90 weeks. It was #1 for more than 40 weeks. It's published in 42 languages. So it struck a chord with, souls all around the world. The second book was Map of Heaven. And that one basically just shows that these are very common experiences, and they've gone on throughout all history. They have tremendous similarities. Pay attention to them. But the big gold mine there is the third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. Came out in 2017. That was co-written with my partner, my life partner, and the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics. Her name is Karen Newell. She's been a great spiritual master and teacher for me, So Living in a Mindful Universe is where you actually start to get answers from a scientific perspective that really put all this forward. And as I said earlier, we have a number of some of the globally renowned leaders in consciousness studies who support Living in a Mindful Universe. It truly is a landmark book in this evolving understanding of consciousness. I would also encourage people to go to sacredacoustics.com to learn much more about the meditative techniques. Also go to UnitedInHopeAndHealing.com to get involved with the webinars that we're putting out to this world. InnerSanctumCenter.com is another pathway into some of that knowledge. These are all ways for people to join the community that we're forming worldwide of like-minded people who share their experiences and observations and thoughts about all this so that we can all grow together.
Well, Dr. Alexander, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm saying to every listener, Proof of Heaven, it's a must-read book. And thank you for this episode of Near-Death TV.